narrative frameworks? How can we discover the root causes of successful teaching and learning? And so I just want to talk a little bit about different types of research, different types of ways we have of understanding how people learn, and how that can help us in improving our practice. So I want to start off by talking about class size. So I think class size, I know when I was very first of people, when I was sort of 4 or 5 years old and I was going back to school, class size is one of the things that you think about a lot. And likewise when I became a teacher, I think class size was something I thought about a lot. And you're always thinking, how many kids in the class, where am I going to sit them always, am I going to fit in? It's a real thing that sort of leaps out to you as a big issue. And there's been a lot of research done on it. It's something that researchers think about a lot, and policymakers think about it a hell of a lot too. Because they think, if you, it seems fairly sort of intuitive, doesn't it? If you reduce the number of people in a class, they get more attention from the teacher, and therefore they'll be able to, they'll learn more, they'll do better. And so there's been a lot of research done into it. Some of it not very robust, not very methodologically sound, but some of it has been very robust and sound. And perhaps the sort of best sort of RCT that was done into this was a project in Tennessee, and it involved, I think, 80 odd schools, 6,000 pupils, lots and lots of classes, and generally respected as a high watermark of research. And it showed that yes, class size does matter, and that smaller class sizes generally are better for pupils will learn more in them. And as a result of that survey, policymakers in California at the time were looking at ways to improve their state's education performance, and they decided that they would spend a lot of money on reducing class size. But the hoped for improvements, they didn't materialise. And in the words of a Scientific American article, which sort of summed up this intervention, they said that this Californian policy consumed billions of dollars, $5 billion it costs, because reducing class size is not inexpensive. It produced only minuscule gains and even some losses. And this, in fact, this Scientific American article, which is from the November 2001 edition, it's kind of trying to probe into this and trying to explain, well, how come you had this really robust RCT and it showed class size made a difference, and yet in California, they seem to read through from this and to intervene to make a policy, and yet it didn't do what everyone hoped it would do. And in fact, there were even, as I say, there were some losses associated with it. And obviously, not only were there some losses associated with it, but the opportunity cost is huge. You think $5 billion, that is such a large sum of money. Think what else you could have done with that sum of money. So what you've got there, I think, what I'm trying to outline is, I guess, the RCTs are incredibly valuable, incredibly important, and absolutely agree with the things that Ben Goldacre said at the start of the day. But in a sense, the RCT is like the first step, right? The aim, I think, of an RCT should be the aim of all good research, right, is to increase our understanding. To know why something happens. And an RCT can tell you that something's happening, and we have to sort of go further and dig further and work out why is it happening, what is happening. And as I say, the authors of the Scientific American article, one of the things they point out about this problem is they say that there's been lots of research on class size and whether it makes a difference, but they say hardly any research has attempted to nail down the ways that smaller class sizes may benefit children. So if you think about that, all of this very expensive research into class sizes, but very little research into why if there is an impact, what is it? Because actually that would lead to very interesting other avenues of research, wouldn't it? Because you could say, well, if the reason why smaller class sizes are better is that the pupils could get more attention, are there other ways we can achieve that? Are there different ways that can happen? So what I'm trying to suggest here is we sort of can't be content just with the RCT. We have to do the RCT and push further and ask ourselves why. And so there's a lovely analogy here. So a lot of what I've spoken about just now is Edie Hirsch has written an article about something very similar. And in this article, he suggests that what we should, a good analogy perhaps for looking at education research is medicine and biochemistry. And so I have a quotation from him. He said, "Medical science continues to advance as it becomes allied with ever more refined laboratory understandings. Its most striking and reliable advances have occurred since medicine became closely tied to biochemistry at a still more fine-grained level, the molecular. By analogy, it is plausible to think that progress in educational research, if it occurs at all, will follow this sort of pattern. So what Hirsch is saying then is, the way that we've been able to develop kind of practical cures and practical solutions for medical problems is we've had a kind of a theory, we've had this biochemistry, we've had an understanding of how the body works, and a theory that accounts for these practical interventions. And that's been able to drive forward these practical advances. So what he's talking then, I think, is about kind of practice and research are going hand in hand, and each informing each other. And if by analogy we can do something similar in education, then one of the things Hirsch argues in his paper is he's saying, well, what will form the role of biochemistry, in a sense, in this analogy? And his argument is, the insights we have from cognitive psychology, from all the research into cognition. And that's what I want to just explore a little bit more today, of talking about, those insights from cognitive psychology that can hopefully provide a theoretical framework where we can situate our RCTs, our practice, and where we can start to ask maybe, when I'm saying the right questions, okay? Because I think what we have as well, I think sometimes, perhaps a little bit in the English-speaking world, we do have a little bit of a distrust of this word theory. And I myself, I'll say, I can be guilty of that. You hear that word, and it immediately seems something, oh, well, it's just a theory, isn't it? It doesn't sound great. But actually, the sort of the scientific term of theory, it means something more, I think, than the way we use it in everyday life. It is something more than that. It's actually the best explanation we have for something. So it has a much higher, it's much more robust word, in a sense, in science than it is in everyday life. And there's a lovely quotation, I've mentioned medicine and biochemistry. And there's a lovely quotation from John Snow. So John Snow, the man who sort of worked out the way that cholera was transmitted in the 19th century, and who was sort of the founder of modern epidemiology. And John Snow, at the time, when he was arguing that cholera was waterborne, he faced such a lot of resistance, and there were lots of people who were arguing that cholera was airborne and it was transmitted by miasma. And there were these parliamentary hearings into it, and he was called up as evidence, and he had some very hostile questioning. People really didn't like what he was saying, it was very counterintuitive. And he gave a lovely response, which I want to give to you. I think it is brilliant. Because one of the questions he got was this. His question said, is your opinion derived from practical experience, or is it mere theory of your own? And again, you can see that with division there, is this based on experience, or is it based on your, just some theory, that very, denigrating tone. And Snow's response, I think, is brilliant. He says, my theory is derived from practice and from observation. Okay, so again, it's that idea of the theory and the practice going hand in hand, and the two going together. And I think that's what would be really valuable and really necessary in education. And as I say, I think that cognitive psychology, cognitive science can provide that kind of theoretical framework to help us ask those right questions. So, and I'll just before I move on to the next part, I'll just say a little bit more about that. There's a lovely quotation by Steven Weinberg, who's a physicist and Nobel laureate as well. And he's talked also about this issue of kind of the theory and the practice and the weight we place, kind of in a sense, on maybe the RCTs or the trials of certain medical drugs. And he says this. He said medical research deals with problems that are so urgent and difficult that proposals of new cures must often be based on medical statistics without understanding how the cure works. But even if a new cure were suggested by experience with many patients, it would probably be met with scepticism if one could not see how it could possibly be explained reductively in terms of sciences like biochemistry and cell biology. So, if someone came up with a cure and you can't really explain the sort of mechanism for it or why it should work, people are going to be sceptical, even if the statistics are saying it works. So he goes on, he says, suppose that a medical journal carried 2 articles reporting 2 different cures for scrofula, one by ingestion of chicken soup, and the other by a king's touch. Even if the statistical evidence presented for these 2 cures had equal weight, I think the medical community, and everyone else, would have very different reactions to the 2 articles. Regarding chicken soup, I think most people would keep an open mind, reserving judgment until the cure could be confirmed by independent tests. Chicken soup is a complicated mixture of good things, and who knows what effect its contents might have on the mycobacteria called scrofula. On the other hand, whatever statistical evidence were offered to show that a king's touch helps to cure scrofula, readers would tend to be very sceptical because they would see no way that such a cure could ever be explained deductively. How could it matter to a mycobacterium whether the person touching its host was properly crowned and anointed, or the eldest son of a previous monarch? Right? So, again, when we have our RCTs, when we have the sort of, we have the statistical weight, we need to come up then with a question, with the question why. Why is this happening, and what's the mechanism for why this will work? And because in the end, and not just because that's going to help us to get the right cure and to get better teaching and learning, but also because I think, sort of philosophically, why is one of the great questions, isn't it? It's that sort of intellectual curiosity, to keep asking that, and that indeed is how all knowledge and all human knowledge, how we expand and how we go forward, right? If we just keep asking that question and want to really get to the essence of the question and get to the heart of it. Okay, so yeah, I guess what I'm trying to do is to reclaim this idea of theory and to suggest the importance of having this theoretical framework of how we learn. And so now if I turn more concretely to what happens in the classroom, if you were in the Dan Willingham video recording earlier, and he said something absolutely brilliant, which chimed with something I wanted to say. And what he said was, yeah, I've written it down here. He said, every teacher inevitably has a theory about how pupils learn, and that's true. Even if we don't think we've got a theory, we've got a theory. Okay, we might say, oh, it's just common sense, or it's being pragmatic. But generally, even when you dig down deep enough, actually there's some kind of theory there. And Dan's words reminded me of that really famous quotation by John Maynard Keynes, which is one of my favourites. He's talking about it in the context of economics. And he says, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Right? And I think that's very, very often the case, that you think you're doing something practical, you think you're being very commonsensical, and actually you're relying on a theory or some ideas and you're not even aware of it. And so what I want to do now is I would like to give 3 examples of where that happened in my teaching practice, where I did something that it was a certain practice I did either because I'd been taught it, or because it just seemed like common sense, or because other people were doing it, and I did it and it seemed to be common sense, and that actually I was relying on a kind of a theory, and a wrong theory in this case, about how pupils learn. And then I want to show how a bit of knowledge of cognitive psychology and some of those theories could have helped my understanding and improved my practice. Okay, so I'm trying to show here, that even when you think you're not relying on theory, you probably that you could be, and that sometimes that can affect your practice. So I've got 3 examples, therefore, 3 examples of this. And so my first one is to do with I'm an English teacher, by the way, so these are all going to be sort of English examples. So my first example is to do with using a thesaurus. So when I was, I had a lesson where I taught some people how to use thesaurus, the concept of using a thesaurus. So you look up a word, and you find lots of synonyms, and it's a really good way of improving your writing and making it more interesting. So I'd done this, and then a lesson or 2 later, the pupils have done some creative writing, and I thought to myself, right, test their thesaurus skills. So some pupils have written some sentences where there's some words that were fairly unoriginal, a bit dull, a bit boring. And I said, okay, right, use your thesaurus, go away, and replace this word with a more interesting one. So I had one boy who had a sentence, it was, I am very good at football. So he went away, looks up in his thesaurus, and he comes back, I am very congenial at football. Right? And, bless you, tried really hard there, you did it all right, and he was very proud of himself. But, we know it doesn't work. Okay, that doesn't work. And then, similarly, again, people come up with a sentence, the weather outside is very nice. And came out with, the weather is very ingratiating. Right? Okay? So, and what I've realised, I guess, what I love about cognitive psychology is that it makes sense of these apparently baffling things. You think you set something up, it works, and you think, brilliant, it's going to go, and then you suddenly come back and you get something like that, the weather is very ingratiating. And had I only known, I was teaching this lesson, I was thinking about 2008. Had I only known, in 1987, a researcher did exactly a very similar experiment, where he did something very, very similar. He gave pupils lots of sentences, gave them a thesaurus, asked them to replace the word with something else, and got equally interesting results. So instead of Mrs. Morrow stirred the soup, he got Mrs. Morrow stimulated the soup. Instead of our family eats out a lot, he got our family erodes a lot. Right? And so on and so on. And it's a really good paper. It's by George Miller, who's a bit of a pioneer in this field. And what he was trying to prove there, and one of the things he was sort of trying to investigate, was the importance of knowledge for skill development, for use of skill. So the theory, in a sense, the wrong theory that I'd been depending on when I set up that lesson, is I depended on a theory of there being such a thing as a generic skill, a generic thesaurus looking up skill. Okay, so I taught my pupils how to look things up in a thesaurus, and I'd assume, right, they know how to do it, now that's fine, they can go and look up whatever they want in a thesaurus. You know, so it's that idea, isn't it? Don't teach your kids that what they need to know, teach them how to look it up, and then they'll never be lost for words, apart from when they say the word is very ingratiating. They're not lost for words, they aren't, they've just got the wrong one. And that was really the sort of the theory I've been wrestling on. I wouldn't have been able to articulate that theory, but that was at the root of it. That was what I was assuming. And what George Miller was trying to show, and what lots of other people tried to show, is that the kind of the paradox here is that you need knowledge in order to be able to look things up. You need a knowledge base. And that's very true with the thesaurus, isn't it? Actually, with the thesaurus, you need to know what all those words mean in order to be able to use it. Okay? And it's even the same with a dictionary. You might think, well, what about a dictionary? You look up the meaning of a word in a dictionary. You know, look at a typical dictionary definition and how difficult it is to understand if you don't know what any of those words mean. It becomes quite circular, doesn't it? If you don't know what those words mean, you have to go and look those up, you have to go and look those up. You have to know what those words mean in order to work out the definition. And so, you know, Miller, based on this and other research, has estimated that you need to know 95% of words in a text to know what the text means. You know, otherwise understanding can just break down. Okay? So you need that knowledge base to begin with. And unless my pupils already know a lot of synonyms for good and nice, a thesaurus actually isn't going to be much help to them. They need to know them, and then when they know them, the thesaurus will be of huge use. And I think, you know, that's sometimes perhaps where we as adults go wrong, because of course research databases are very, very useful for us as adults, because we have that knowledge base to be able to make use of them. But we forget the knowledge that we depend on. And so that's what, you know, that's the sort of Miller experiment. And yeah, I wish that had been something I'd read and had known about before I began teaching. So that's one example, I think, of an experiment, of a theory that could have helped me and could have helped my practice. So my second example is the baseball. It's a baseball reading experiment. Okay, so this time my experience, the practical experience I had was I was teaching some pupils. We were doing GCSE past papers. And if you're an English teacher, you know, you'll know that in English in year 11, it's the same with lots of subjects too, of course, but you know, you end up in that run-up to exams doing lots and lots of past papers. So we were doing lots and lots of past papers, and I was teaching my pupils the kind of skills they need to do these past papers, right? So we do sort of lessons on inference. I say, right, yeah, inference is a really important skill. You need to know how to infer, so we have lessons on how to infer. And then we do lessons on sort of finding the main idea, and on skimming and scanning the text, and on highlighting key bits. You know, we all had highlighters, and we make sure you take the highlighter into the exam, and you know, highlight the key parts of the passage, and what have you. And so we did lots and lots of things on this, and we did lots of past papers. And I was teaching. I had 2 year 11 classes, and they were both top sets at the time. And they were, you know, they were smart kids. They worked hard. They were really, really well motivated. And they did really well. And they did all go on to get good grades in the end as well. And they were generally sort of going quite well at their past papers. And then one day we did this past paper. It was from the Welsh Board, and it was an extract from an Arthur C. Clarke short story. And the short story was, you know, it's Arthur C. Clarke, so it was science fiction. It was set in a futuristic London. Where there's a new ice age. So London's been totally submerged in snow and ice. And there's just one man left living in this futuristic London. And in the story, he hears noises. He keeps hearing these noises, they're coming from the north. And he says to himself, you know, what could this noise be? And he hopes against hope that it's men, or it's some kind of army, or it's people coming to save him. That's what he's hoping. And it turns out, the punchline of the story is that the noise is a glacier, and the glacier is moving towards him. And I did this in total with 55 pupils to 2 different classes. And not one of them knew what a glacier was. And in both cases, I'd set them this paper, and they were a good class, and they settled down to it, working quietly. And after about 15, 20 minutes, I just had, people looking up at me, plaintive despair in their eyes. I can't do this, what's it talking about? And both times, the pupils, it wasn't just that, missing out that one word meant that they could, they could work out what it meant, or they could, use their strategies to find a way around it. They were just really stuck, that they didn't know what a glacier was. And in fact, again, they were a good class, and they did listen to all the strategies I told them, and I did take in lots of papers, and they'd highlighted lots of things. And one or two of them had even, more than one or two of them, quite a few of them had tried to work out what it meant from context. They tried to sort of apply that skill, and none of them had got close. And in fact, the guesses they had for the word glacier, they guessed that glacier was the name of a wild tribe of people, or a tribe of sort of wild animals. So those are their guesses for what glacier was. And in case you think, that's sort of anecdotal, obviously it is anecdotal, but this was a real exam paper. So I went back and read the examiner's report for it, and the examiner's report said exactly the same thing. The examiner's report said, we were surprised by the number of pupils who thought a glacier was a wild, a tribe of people, or wild animals. Okay? So what you saw there, again, is that all these strategies that I prepped my pupils with, and all these sort of tips and techniques, if the pupils were confronted with something they didn't know, those tips and techniques and strategies had very little value. And they could be absolutely stymied by a sort of a word that they didn't know, a concept that they didn't have, by the lack of knowledge. And again, this is something that, this was something I was teaching, I think this one in sort of about 2010. This is something that, there's a great experiment on this too, from 1988. It's by Rex and Leslie, The Effect of Prior Knowledge on Good and Poor Readers' Memory of Text. And they did something very elegant experiment. They took two groups of pupils. So they took good readers and poor readers. Okay, so pupils who previously, on standardised reading tests, have been deemed to be proficient. I think this is an American thing, the term proficient and not proficient. And so they put them into those two groups, and then they divided each group again into pupils who knew a lot about baseball and pupils who didn't. And again with the poor readers. Okay, so in a sense, you have sort of four groups of pupils in terms of these categories. And then they gave them some passages to read about baseball. And they gave the pupil the test on the passage at the end of it. And what they found was that the poor readers, who knew a lot about baseball, did better than the good readers who didn't know a lot about baseball. And again, I think if you are an English teacher, especially if you taught those stats papers or the GCSE papers, that is not surprising. And I can remember, my colleagues saying all the time to me, one year they got a GCSE paper and it was on Michael Owen, it was an extract from his autobiography. The kids did really well. And the next year they got one on Ellen MacArthur. And I can remember my colleagues saying, what do our kids know about sailing? This is outrageous, putting that in, it's just this, it's some middle-class plot. But, the point is the same pupil could get a very, very good grade on a reading paper about something they know a lot about, and a very poor grade on a reading paper about something they don't know a lot about. And that baseball reading experiment has been replicated in a lot of different contexts. And one context it's been replicated in is photocopy technology. And I often think to myself, I'm pretty certain, I like to think I'm a good reader, but I'm pretty certain if I were giving a reading passage on photocopy technology, that I wouldn't really be the best or come out with the highest score on that. Okay? So again, the sort of the deep theoretical point here is similar to the point I was making before, which is that reading is not a generic skill. Reading is dependent on knowledge. And so then you think, well, what makes a good reader? I think, generally a good reader is someone who knows a little about a broad range of things. But even those good readers can still be stymied if they don't know the relevant knowledge. So likewise, we think of ourselves as good readers, but if we were to get a passage, as I say, on something quite abstruse about photocopy technology or whatever, or a scientific paper, our reading skills would not be as good. So reading is a domain-specific skill, like all skills. And so again, that would be something. Had I known about that research paper, had I known about that theory, that would have been something that would have really helped me with my pupils and with my practice, and I would have changed my practice, and then I didn't rely so much on practicing these strategies over and over. Okay, so that's my second example. So then my third example, therefore, is something slightly a little bit different. Again, in English teacher. So it's about teaching grammar. And so, again, my first year teaching. And this was a unit I taught. It was a writing skills unit. And it was a 6-week project. And the aim was, writing skills. The aim was to get my pupils to write more accurately. And so I had a whole sort of set of sort of punctuation, grammar, sort of things that I wanted to teach them and get them to use. So there was a few things about nouns and adjectives that I wanted them to do, and a bit about the subordinate clause, and a bit about apostrophes. So various things to help them improve their writing and make it more accurate. And I structured this unit around this project. And the idea of this project was that all of the pupils would, we imagined we were all living in a village, imaginary village, and the pupils each lived in a certain house in the village, and they had, to use their imaginations to create a family they lived in, and to get into groups, and they would each be a person in that family, and they would invent a sort of story for them. And then we would run this project for 6 weeks, and various things would happen. An MP would be elected, and then perhaps someone would come and cut down a tree in the middle of the village, and so on and so forth. And the idea was that this would give them a stimulus for their writing, so that then they wouldn't just be learning about these grammatical concepts in a vacuum. They would be using them when they did their writing about their family and about where they lived in the village and all these kind of things. So it was to kind of make it more sort of meaningful for them. And I'll never forget, we did this unit, and there was a scene where there was a tree in the middle of the village had to be cut down, and then there was all discussion about who should cut it down, whether they should do it with a chainsaw or an axe, and all these kind of things. And that was in the same lesson. Well, how I structure lessons, I generally do a sort of 10 or 15-minute starter on the grammatical unit, the grammatical bit of knowledge for that lesson, and then we'd sort of do some writing based on this project, this village. And what I'll never forget is at the end of that unit, asking the pupils, so what have you learned, and what have you done here, and what have we learned about here, and hardly any of them mentioned the apostrophe, and for so many of them, their abiding memory of that unit was the chainsaw and the axe, or it was, it was about how I was so-and-so's adopted son, and I was so-and-so's long-lost son, and these were the things that they'd remembered from that unit. And I was like, well, why didn't you remember? Why didn't you remember this? It was a writing skills unit. And yet, you don't seem to have remembered anything about this, and their use of the apostrophe was still just as poor as it was when they'd begun. And so again, this was something that, there's research and literature which, had I known about, would have been really helpful. So this one is a paper from 1979. It's called Long-Term Memory for a Common Object. And so what they did in this experiment is, I will just show you the slide here. So it's this one here. Right, sorry. Sorry. Here we go. Right. Penny experiment. Aha. So researchers. So in this experiment, they showed a group of Americans. These are American pennies, 1-cent coins. They showed them a picture of 20, and you'll notice it was slightly different. So some have got the date here, some have got the date here, some have got liberty, some have got God we trust, whatever. So they've all got various different things. And they asked the subjects, they said, right, which one is the actual American penny? And so obviously, these people are American. Think of it yourself. Think of how many times in your life you have seen a penny, right? Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, a lot of times. And yet the people in the experiment did incredibly badly on this. People are very, very poor at picking out what's the real penny, okay, which is the real one. And yet, this is something that you've seen, of course these subjects you've seen, thousands, tens of thousands of times. So how come they've seen something such a lot, but they don't remember anything about it? Okay, and the answer is, it's to do with attention and it's to do with thought. And the line that Dan Willingham uses on this one is, he says, memory is the residue of thought. So in a sense, the brain makes a bet, makes a gamble. Anything I have to think about a lot is probably important, therefore I should remember it. So if you think about something a lot, you'll probably remember it. And obviously in this case, it's a thinking about. You know, you do have to be thinking about and paying attention to it and focusing on it. And what happened here is familiarity is not the same as that. You know, these people, you are familiar with the penny, but you haven't really thought about it. You haven't really focused your attention on it. Okay, that's the difference. And in a sense, that's what happens. So yeah, memory is a residue of thought. Every time you think about something, it leaves a little residue in memory. The more you think about it, something, the bigger those residues in a sense become. So what happened in this lesson I'd done on the writing skills project is my pupils weren't really thinking about what I wanted them to learn. My intention was for them to learn it, but in a sense, you know, that was my intention, okay? I hadn't designed the learning activities in such a way that they did focus their attention and think about those things that I did want them to learn. And so, you know, what I really need to do was to set up a lesson, design a lesson that focused their attention and thoughts on, if I want them to learn the apostrophe, you know, on the apostrophe. And that, you know, those things I've done about the village and those things I've done about chopping down the trees, they have their value because in lots of ways they help the pupils to work better together and they're learning important, valuable things there, and that's all good. But it wasn't helping them to learn about the apostrophe. Okay, so if I wanted them to teach about that, I needed to set up lessons where time and attention was given to that. Okay, so that's the third experiment. So I've outlined therefore 3 experiments that I wish I'd known about when I was training, and of course there was this, you know, sort of a similar sort of theoretical thing that links all 3, which is what I was saying about the domain specificity. A bit of a clunky phrase, the domain specificity of skills, the way that they are tied to domain knowledge, and about the structure of learning activities, about thoughts and the importance of things being committed to long-term memory and of how we commit them to long-term memory, and that importance of knowledge in long-term memory. So those are 3 experiments that I found very useful reading, and as I say, what I love about reading these things is they do give me that sense of you know, that's what I was saying before about that sense of understanding. You know, it's nice, isn't it? You know, I think when you burrow down to the essence of something and think, aha, that's why. You know, that makes sense. You know, it's something really compelling. I think it's one of the reasons why people love detective novels. You know, they give that feeling of you know, of satisfaction, of concluding. You know, pulling all those disparate strands together and saying this is how it works, how it ties together. And I think that's one of the nice things, as I say, about cognitive psychology. And so I would say, you know, this conference is about research and the importance of research and what good research should be. And for me, that is what good research should be, to answer that question, why? And to go back to my title, you know, to say, what are the root causes of, you know, successful teaching and learning? How do we get there? So I would say, yeah, you know, RCs are fantastic and they are the first stage. And let's keep going and let's keep asking why. And hopefully, you know, we can be even more successful. So thank you.
Could you go back to the slide with the reference to that reading?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Or will these be stored
somewhere? Can I give them to Tom and they go on the website?
Yeah.
I'll put the reference up on the website, yeah.
In reference to the example that you gave of the glacier,
yes.
I thought I'd suggest, and see if you agree or not,
Yeah.
that the fault didn't actually lie with your teaching, it actually lay with an exam board that doesn't want to examine knowledge and instead is misguidedly believing that there are transferable skills that they're able to assess. Yeah. Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, yes and no. It's an interesting one because I do think that in the case of English should be testing reading comprehension. So in a sense, I don't have a problem with an English GCSE paper having an unseen test on it. The problem is that I think in other subjects I would say more so, in a sense. I do think there should be an unseen reading paper in English. The problem is that we've forgotten that to do well on an unseen reading paper, you need that wealth of knowledge. And this is why, and Dan Willingham is very, very good on this, at primary school in particular, we've devoted so much time to teaching literacy. And we've taken that time away from history, geography, science, art. And the paradox is that teaching history, geography, science, art, and the knowledge that's involved there is actually what makes you a better reader. So, but I would agree with you. I do think you've got a point about examples. And what was really revealing is I read the examiner's report, and he's, when he said in it, I was very surprised. He said, all these pupils thought the glacier were a tribe, or the glaciers were wild animals. He said, I was very surprised that the pupils thought this, given, and I think his phrase is, given the current popularity of films about disaster, films about natural disasters, and the topical nature of climate change. And that was very revealing. He seemed there to me to be kind of outsourcing the teaching of knowledge to the media, films, and my reaction was, I would have said, well, what about geography? What are they doing in geography? And his reaction was, haven't they watched enough good films lately? So I do think there is an issue with exams not doing the knowledge. Yeah. So yeah, is that answer your question? Yeah.
I found in agreement with a lot of what you're saying, and I think vocabulary and domain knowledge are really important. But I think there's also an issue here that in geography and Key Stage 3, glaciers are on the curriculum.
Yeah.
So what is happening to make children not be able to make the connections and retain the knowledge?
Yeah.
And we have to go back to pedagogy, making pedagogy memorable. And memory is also situated in strong emotional experiences as well as just being told what things are. So it kind of reminds me when you talked about the village and the tree, and I'm glad you came back to it and said, really, my purpose of the teaching was the grammar. So to set the context of the drama in a family with a village with a tree and an MP, that was the problem. But if your teaching had been about the growth of the tree and the community and something about the sustainability of the environment, that would have been a very memorable learning experience for those children. So how can we make the glacier, emotionally resonant and memorable for those children?
I think that you're right, glaciers are on the Key Stage, they are on the curriculum. And just as I said, well, apostrophes are on the curriculum. When I taught that unit on writing skills, but in a sense that's the third experiment I talked about, is that they're on the curriculum, but I think sometimes when we're teaching them, the point about the lesson I taught about the tree and what have you is that it didn't help them understand the tree. And according to the theory, it shouldn't have done. So I think you're right, how do we make the glacier and whatever? I think that for me is the art of good teaching, and that is why teaching is such a challenge. I mean, because in lots of these cases it isn't easy, and in a lot of these cases you're dealing with abstract, intangible things that pupils find hard to put into concrete terms. And so, I mean, one of the things that Willingham says, which I like, is he says, the power of narrative. It does seem to be something that humans are kind of hardwired to have this, to appreciate narrative and remember it. So I think that's got to be one thing about framing things as narrative. So, I'm not a geographer, but I guess with the glacier, you could do it as, and I do like the thing of setting things up as questions. You could do it as, why does this look like it is now, when it's a story that takes us back, hundreds of thousands of years, whatever. So that kind of thing, I think setting things up as stories is a nice one. Yeah. And I'm not making that easy, because it is a challenge. And that's what I love about teaching.
Do you think there's an argument for, and I say this as a science teacher, and I'm quite comfortable with words like theory and evidence and so on. Is there an argument for rephrasing some of these things? Because I know that for some people they hear words like theory or they see numbers and it puts that barrier in straight away. And if so, what is the way to go about that?
That's a good question, isn't it? Yeah, I don't know. Theory is, as you say, people often just have that emotional reaction to it, and it puts barriers down or whatever. And there's the same with numbers. I don't know what you suggested in its place, though. You got any suggestions? I
don't know. I don't know if she's trying to force it through and say, no, this is what evidence means. It doesn't mean what. But
I suppose if you're sort of it's sort of Ben Golding's point, it's a wider point about sort of these terms and how they're used and sort of general sort of understanding of them, isn't it? I suppose. Not just in education, it's valuable in all fields, isn't it? But no, it's an interesting one. I hadn't thought about that. It'd be interesting to think about the kind of words you can use instead. Yeah, okay, right, that's it. Thank you very much.